Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. So today is the second of a pair of lectures on usability and user experience, focusing on heuristics. I'm going to finish off by talking of the heuristics at different levels, particularly talking about the linguistic and the navigational level. Then I'm going to talk about some other kinds of heuristics that people have articulated that are sort of nothing to do with levels, if you like, cross-level heuristics. I'm going to tell you about two ideas that Don Norman made popular that are very influential ideas in terms of thinking about all kinds of design interfaces. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about dark patterns and then very briefly mention prototypes. But you're going to have a chance to learn more about prototyping, and particularly the mechanics of prototyping, in recitation on Thursday. OK, so the linguistic level. So the first heuristic at the linguistic level is to speak the user's language. And this is a classic example that people have made fun of for years, that there was an HP printer that displayed this message, PC load letter. And nobody knew what this meant. Does anyone have any idea what this actually means? Want to have a guess? Yes, remind me of your name.
Casey.
Casey.
Does it mean like load letter-sized paper?
Yeah, exactly. And what do you think PC means?
I have no idea.
So it actually means paper cassette. But Casey pretty much got it. So if all users were as smart as Casey, there'd be no problem. The problem is we're not all as smart as Casey. There's been a tendency recently to think much more about what error messages should say. You know, here's, I think, a particularly nice example from Apple that says, this is an application downloaded from the internet. Are you sure you want to open it? And then it tells you, when this was actually downloaded, at what time, and what URL it came from. So there's a nice example of something that really makes sense. So the message is use simple terms, word things very carefully, and in particular, there's also kind of an emotional aspect, which is don't blame the user, because users really don't like that. One of the areas in particular where users are very touchy, of course, are when the system crashes. And you might not be able to do anything at that point, but it's good to try and not piss off the user any more than necessary. So here are some classic examples. The Amiga would print a guru meditation string, which were kind of nice. Here's Windows, which says, your PC ran into a problem and needs to restart. We're just collecting some error info, and then we'll restart for you. So that's sort of pretty friendly and nice. This is the one that I remember was the curse of my first job. I actually had one of the first Macintoshes. That really dates me, doesn't it? When I was a software developer. And when this thing crashed, it would add insult to injury, because aside from crashing and displaying this message saying, bang, all your data is lost, it would then offer you only one option, which was to press the restart button, which ensured that all the data you had would be lost. So you had to participate in your own destruction. So that was kind of miserable. A second heuristic is to make consistent use of names. And names are not only names made with letters, but also icons, symbols. And so here's an example that's always bugged me. If you look at the design of the Google apps, you'll see that they mostly have some very nice icons, but some of these icons are pretty confusing. In particular, notice that there's this icon here, you see on the top, on the second line. And that line means grid view, and then there's this icon, and that means open up the collection of Google apps. And there's really no compelling reason that a 2x2 square should mean grid view and a 3x3 should mean applications. Of course, you get used to that, and you can say, well, this is just a minor stumble. But the point is, if you have enough of these things, it makes an application much harder to use. So you want to be consistent and use the same name or symbol throughout an application. I think, this is my own personal belief, that parts of speech are very important. So here's another Google example. This is from the Google Forums interface. And I at least find it very disconcerting that there isn't a uniform part of speech in this menu. You see, they all seem to be, they all start with verbs. Join requests, outstanding, actually they don't. invite members. You see, they're all inconsistent. It starts with all members, and then it goes to invite members. Direct add members seems to be like invite members. It seems to be an action. Outstanding invite seems to be another query. Join requests is sort of ambiguous. It could mean, I don't think it means you join the request, so it's not an action. It's probably request to join. But the point is, just having these diverse parts of speech already kind of throws you. It makes you wonder, well, why would I want to see all members? And are those members that I'm going to see somehow different? Is that going to give me different options from what these other things would give me? So use verbs and nouns for actions and queries and be consistent. A very old heuristic, which I think is now well understood, but is nevertheless, well, like all these heuristics really, perhaps obvious until you build your own app and forget it, which is a very easy thing to do, is to understand the difference in recognition and recall. So in the Unix shell, it had all the functionality, but you had to remember how to do it, or you had to search. Now it's a bit easier because we have Google to help us, but before that you had to use these man page things, which were these quite an unhelpful way to discover what a function did. In contrast, with WYSIWYG interfaces, the options that are available are displayed to you when you actually interact. So if you choose here, for example, I've selected the different ways to organize the folder, and it gives me the list of possibilities. So I don't have to remember what the possibilities are. I just have to be able to recognize them and decide the one that I want. So the heuristic is, let the user recognize what they want and don't force remembering. Now, a more subtle one is this notion of information sent. And the idea is that as a user, you're sort of sniffing around in the application the way a pig would be sniffing around for a nice truffle under the ground. That you sort of know what you want, and you're following these little clues for how to get there. So here's an example on the left and the right of two different excerpts from two different websites that are selling books. And the question for you is, does one of them seem to give you more scent, more clues about where to go than the other? What do you think? Would you find, if you saw these two, would you find one of them more attractive than the other? And is there a reason for that? So that's a good point. So the fact that Target actually seems to sort of give you some kind of hierarchical organization into categories, that seems nice. The actual categories are quite unhelpful, right? They seem to be really arbitrarily selected and things that Target just seems to want to promote. Certainly the structure of the Amazon interface immediately makes it easy to sort of see where to take your eye and what you might want to look at. And what do you think about the numbers in gray in the Amazon interface? Julia?
Yeah, I think that it does possibly reveal some more information about like the number of books that fall into that category.
Exactly, and that's really helpful, right? Because you know that if you click on that, if you click on, to see the ones with, 1 star and up, you're going to hit 3.5 million books. That's not going to be a very useful category to browse through. Whereas if you chose, for example, the Hugo and Nebula Awards, you're going to see 25 books. So there's actually a surprising amount of information in those numbers about how useful your next step is likely to be. So the point is that you can, in these small ways, you can actually give a lot of information about what will happen subsequently, and in guiding the user through these different paths. Here's an example that I came across. What do you think of this? This is CVS's website. And I actually looked again, I actually did this a while back, but I looked again last night, and it hasn't changed very much. They have some stuff underneath it, but it's still pretty much the same. So what do you think of this in terms of information sent? Do you have a good feeling just glancing at this, knowing where you would go? It's quite a lot of cognitive work, right? This is making you do a lot of work in terms of reading and figuring out what all these labels mean and deciding which ones you're going to follow. And I have to say that when I looked at it, there were a bunch of things that confused me immediately, perhaps partly just because I'm British. So the one that was a British confusion was, you see the store down there and the shop up there? It took me a moment to realize that shop means buy stuff and store means find a physical store near you. But since stores are called shops in England, that was not immediately obvious to me. My gut reaction was, well, maybe that's the online store down there. So that's potentially a little bit confusing. I also actually found it a little bit confusing that pharmacy and shop were two different options. What if I want to buy something from the pharmacy? Do I go to shop or do I go to pharmacy? So although in some sense you can imagine someone arguing that this is a perfectly well-structured interface, it places quite a burden on the user in figuring out where to go. So that's really what information sent is all about. Following conventions is really important. And we're always, many of us, want to do new and exciting things. But you have to remember, if you do something new, even if it's better, then you're going to pay some price in the unfamiliarity. And sometimes it's better just to do the standard thing, because that's what your users know. And this is an example which Google has actually undone. Fortunately, they stopped doing this, but it's something they used to do. Can you see that this is for preferences in Chrome? Can you see there are 4 different menu options, 4 different tabs here, for 4 different titles, let's call them. It's actually not clear they're tabs. That's another part of the problem, right? Which is that they haven't shown this as a conventional tabbing interface. But can you see that history, extensions, and settings are grayed out? What do you think that means? What's your immediate guess? Yeah, is that Jonathan? Yeah.
That's not the active selection.
It means it's not the active selection. So like Casey sitting next to you, you're smarter than I am. I didn't figure that out originally. What might you guess I thought as a dumb user? Tell me. Say it again. Jasmine.
You might think that you can't click on them. There's some sort of reason that's not.
Yeah, exactly. So as Jasmine says, you might think that it's grayed out because it's not available. That is, in fact, the conventional use of graying out. Okay? So they've actually done a bunch of things here to flout the conventions. They've actually got a tabbed interface, and they haven't shown tabs physically, and they've used this graying out convention in an unconventional way. So follow conventions, and it's not just conventions, generic sort of conventions, but it's also conventions of a particular app, so that you can do things uniformly within an app, of a platform and a culture, and so on. So that is so much for linguistic levels. Now let's talk about navigational levels. So the navigational level of heuristic design is basically thinking about trying to figure out where you are and where you can go in an app. So there are lots of useful things that apps do, and you've seen all of these. You can provide pagination, these things called breadcrumbs, where you basically give a path that allows you to move up and down hierarchically. You can have filters, and what else? This is, and tabs. That's taken from Lightroom. So these are all different ways in which you can give a user a sense of where they are in a navigation and what their options are. And there's really not a lot. I think this is pretty obvious. But one of the things that's useful, and that I hope you'll be able to use these slides for, is just to remind yourself of the kinds of options you have, and to be able to go through these things and ask yourself, have I made it clear to my user what their location is in my app? So again, these are all very straightforward things, but they're easy to get wrong. One of the useful ideas is the idea of an accelerator, which is that you can provide shortcuts to users to enable them to get to a point more quickly than going through a normal path. So standard accelerators are things like auto-completion, shortcuts, and it's very nice if the shortcuts can be recognized rather than recalled. And then aggregation is an example of a shortcut where you can select multiple items and then apply an action to them to be applied in concert to all of them. So here's an example of 2 old machines that have accelerators. What kinds of accelerators would you expect on these machines? Yes, Billy?
Quick minute or quick 30 seconds.
Exactly. So on the microwave, a quick minute or quick 30 seconds. And they've done a lot of work in the design. So typically, if you press the 1 button and do nothing else, you'll get a minute. If you press the start button, you'll get 30 seconds. What about the phone? Yes. Is it Alex? Nick, sorry. Like redial, for example. Exactly. One of the things that's very important is for the user to be offered actions to take them to the next place that are actually consistent with the context that they're in. So one of the nice things that happens in modern interfaces is that when you, for example, right-click on an object, you get a collection of options that's relevant to the particular context. And you don't get things that would fail because they're out of context. Now this seems completely obvious to us, but in early user interfaces, it was quite common to offer the user a whole collection of options that made no sense at all. Costa?
Earlier in the accelerator slide, when you talked about the text main shortcut,
Yeah.
you made a remark they should be understandable and not recallable.
Yes, what I said was that I was referring to the heuristic of recognition and not recall, that one of the nice things is that by actually listing the shortcut in the menu, right, you essentially, every time you go to it, you can see what the shortcut would be. You don't have to remember it. You don't have to go to the user manual to look it up. That's what I was saying. I suppose it's not really a perfect example of recognition rather than recall, because if you're just sitting staring at the keyboard, there's nothing to tell you, that this is the button you need to press to save the file. So the heuristic is that you put together all the things the user expected to need, and you make available only the actions that are suitable for context. Now, one of the things to consider when you're designing paths through an application is you want to make the paths short. And so you want to think not only about what the natural logical structure is for traversal through your application, but what might be a shortcut that somebody would want to take through that traversal. So here's a simple example. You don't, logically speaking, if you're organizing a newspaper, right, you might put the weather in the local section. Let's suppose it's just the local weather, right? You certainly wouldn't put it at the top level organizationally. And yet, when someone looks at a newspaper, chances are the very first thing they want to see is, well, what's the weather today? And that's why if you actually look at the New York Times online, they actually put the weather on the front page. And in fact, in the physical edition as well, in the top right-hand corner, when you get the newspaper, it says weather in Boston. And so that's a nice example of adding redundant short paths to your application. So you want to think about minimizing the number of steps that the user needs to take for the most common functions. Undo and cancel. So here's another thing that, I'm really just, I hope, preaching to the choir here. These are things that you know, so this is just by way of reminding you how important these things are. Lightroom, I think, is actually a fantastic example of undo, because the way they implement undo in Lightroom is, first of all, every time you undo, it flashes a little message saying what it undid. So that's really reassuring, so that you know exactly what's happening. And the other thing that's really nice is that in many applications, they separate actions performed by the user into side-effecting actions and non-side-effecting actions. And the undo only applies to the side-effecting actions. But in Lightroom, they don't make that distinction. So undo applies to absolutely everything. So if you move your cursor around and select different thumbnails, for example, then when you undo, the cursor moves back again. Not literally the physical cursor, but the selection of the thumbnails moves back. And so they've done it completely consistently with everything that's undoable. And it's really quite delightful. If you can't undo, then canceling, is an important option. So the heuristic is provide undo if you can for every action, and canceling especially for long operations. Okay, so that was a sort of lightning review of these ideas of heuristics applied to the other levels. I now want to talk a little bit about these sort of cross-level heuristics. And there are, in fact, many people, here are some of them, who have proposed different kinds of usability heuristics. The most well-known heuristics are those listed by Jacob Nielsen, because he and his colleagues actually wrote a paper about the use of heuristic evaluation in user interface design, which was very influential. And that was a kind of formal process in which you sat down with 3 to 5 people and you went through these particular heuristics. And he did experiments to demonstrate how many people you needed to do these kinds of evaluations and how efficacious they were and so on. And so he's in some sense sort of seen as the leader in the field of heuristics. But of course, this idea of heuristics is really just a collection of sort of our experience of what's good in a design. And so many people have ideas about what the heuristics should be. And the heuristics that I've shown you so far are basically all the ones that I collected from 6813 that we've been teaching for years in the usability course. But there are many others that are worth looking at. I think Bruce Tog, as he's called, Tognazzini's First Principles of Interaction Design, are really thought-provoking. It's a very long list, and I don't think it can be applied quite as prescriptively as our heuristics, but it's certainly worth reading. And Don Norman has some really interesting heuristics, and I'm going to mention some of them after. But when you look at most of these heuristics, I would say what they typically come down to is falling into three categories. One says you should be able to see stuff, right? But when you're looking at a user interface, you should know what's going on. You should know what actions you have available. You should know what the internal state is. It should have a certain transparency to it, right? That's what visibility is. And there should be feedback also. When you do something, you should know what you've done, right? Because there's nothing more disconcerting than performing some action and then not knowing whether it actually succeeded or not. Consistency, as I mentioned, many writers talk about the importance of consistency at different levels, and whether it's within an application, whether it's across the applications within a particular platform, whether it's in a domain like air traffic control or online stores or whatever, or whether it's a cultural consistency, what people's cultural expectations are. And the last category is an interesting one, which we haven't had much chance to talk about, and it's the idea that if you want to help people not make errors, one way you can do that is you can actually prevent them from making errors. You can constrain them. The simplest way is you can not offer them actions that don't apply in the current state. But you can do other things as well to try and prevent errors by thinking creatively about constraints. So this is the paper that Nielsen wrote, which was published in 1990, and you're welcome to read, but you don't actually need to read this to do the assignment that you're going to be doing with heuristic evaluation, because we're asking you just to do a very simple application in which you yourself just go through the heuristics that we've given you and judge your interface in terms of those heuristics. What I would like you to do now is a little exercise, the exercise is based on the question that has been posed by some of whether or not Apple has actually gone rogue, in the sense that Apple, was the great initiator of beautiful, not only beautiful, I shouldn't say beautiful, usable interfaces. And Apple put out some of the earliest usability guides. One of the things that made Apple applications very successful and usable was that Apple mandated how an application should look and how it should behave. And they wrote wonderful documentation for application designers telling them what guidelines they should follow. And now a number of people are saying that Apple has lost it themselves because they've become so obsessed with beauty that, and having very lovely looking interfaces that they worry less about usability. So here are just a few examples that have bothered me. The first is invisible controls. So this is Apple Mail, and here is a file that is attached to this message. You can, in fact, drag that file to your desktop. But the question is, what would you do if you wanted to save it to some folder and you didn't want to drag it? And the answer is, you would click there. And if you click right there in the middle of the message, this little widget will come up, and then the one on the right-hand side with a little down arrow will actually reveal a menu for you to click, like that, and then you can save it. So that control is completely invisible. Apple has avoided spoiling the beauty of the message by actually not showing that until you hover over it. Here's an example. One of the things that people have talked about is how you should make it clear what kinds of actions can be performed. And here's an example where I'm just looking at the About screen for Keynote, and you can actually see a little bit from the gray type at the bottom that there's actually more text there. But there's no indication that I might actually be able to scroll this text. And I actually have to move my cursor over to the right-hand side. And if I move it in exactly the right spot, then a scroll bar will appear. It's also a little funny that you can't actually change the size of the window. Apple can be a little dictatorial about these things. Scroll bars in general are something that Apple went a little crazy about. And I don't know who in Apple decided to do this, but it's kind of bizarre. If you look at most applications, I think in fact all applications that use the standard Apple scroll bar, they behave like this. They show no scroll bar until you actually hover over it. And then when you hover over it, you get this insanely thin scroll bar. And if you want a thicker scroll bar, you sort of have to move even closer and like get right over it, and then it, did it do it? Yeah, I think it did. And then it fattens a little bit. Another example. This is from iTunes, and this is one of the strange things about iTunes conceptually. This is using iTunes to do a software update. iTunes is a sort of jack of all trades, a concept with a million purposes, which is quite a problem. So you can see that I'm updating my iPhone, but there's not really much evidence that anything is actually in progress. Now, in fact, there is. If you're an Apple expert, you will know where to look. Can anyone here tell us? Where would you need to look to know what your progress is? Yeah, you're signaling. Remind us of your name? Manny. Yes, exactly. Top right. It turns out that little thing up there is the progress bar. And if you click on it, then it will actually give you a little bit more information. And every time I see this, I sort of hear Apple saying to me contemptuously, you have a network connection that's so slow, you actually have to wait for 2.5 gigabytes. Like, what's your problem? But many of us have network connections where we actually have to wait for 2 gigabytes. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you just to pick one of these features, invisible controls, ambivalent scroll bars, or the hidden progress thing, which one could argue promote beauty over usability. And I'd like you to just pick one or more of those heuristics and explain what's wrong with it using the heuristics. Does that make sense? In other words, if you were doing a heuristic evaluation and not just saying it was annoying, but trying to give some more substance to say that this was a design flaw with respect to a body of knowledge, which heuristic might you pick to explain that particular flaw? Okay? Okay, why don't we discuss this? Let us go back a few slides. Let's start with the invisible controls. Who has some thoughts about what heuristics this might violate? Yes, Megan. That's a great one. Certainly, having a 0 size would mean it takes a long time to find. I would say even when it appears, there's a little bit of a Fitts law issue, right? Because you do have to futz around to hit that point. So certainly Fitts law, yeah, that's a good one. What else? Yeah, Darius. Yeah, certainly visibility. It's not showing you what options are available. It's pretty hard to find it. There's a kind of Where's Waldo that's very fashionable, in a lot, particularly in phone apps. It's like, if you're a cool person, then you've sort of played around with everything and you've checked clicking every single pixel on the screen to know what will happen so that you've figured it out. So there's a sort of major cultural violation of the idea of visibility. Anyone have any other ones for this? All right, let's move on to another one. How about what were we talking about? The scroll bars. Yeah. I don't remember your name. Anthony. Yeah, exactly. That first scroll bar, it's doubly annoying that it's too small, right? Because in order to make it larger, you have to move into that very small area. And that takes time. That's right. So excellent. So Fitts law. What else? Yes, Jocelyn.
Visibility, feedback.
Yep, there's visibility and feedback. You can't see it's there. Yep. Anything else? Julia. Yeah, that's right. And actually, just even to know whether or not the document that you're looking at actually stretches over more than what's visible in the window. That's right. Yeah, great. Any others? Okay, and what was the, yeah, and the progress bar or non-progress bar? Thoughts about this one and its violations? Yes, you'll have to remind me of your name. Tyler.
I said it violates feedback as well as undo and cancel.
Yeah, I think that's right. It does, in the sense that if you haven't discovered it, there's certainly, actually, and was there even an undo there? Maybe there wasn't. Yeah, there's no option to actually abort that. So you're right, it certainly fails that. And this can be quite an expensive mistake, right? Because if you're doing, the most likely scenario under which you want to cancel it is that you discover you really need your bandwidth and your connection is really poor. And so it's soaking up all your bandwidth and you can't stop it, and you're in real trouble. Very annoying indeed. Great. What else? There are definitely other things going on here. Michael's sort of looking like he has something to say. No? Any suggestions? Well, certainly there's a visibility issue. Someone, when I was walking around, suggested there's an anticipation and context issue. Because in some sense, Apple's game here is to say, well, you don't need to know this because it's just happening in the background. But you really do, because iTunes won't do anything else with your iPhone when you're in this state. Right? So it really is a modal interface, even though it's pretending not to be. And so it would be really nice if you knew that your context was that you were in the middle of this download and what your options were. In fact, you don't have many options. Maybe that's why they're not showing them to you. Yes, Michael?
How about this law?
Yep.
Really far away.
That's right. So if once you discover that you want to click on it, it's not that easy. Yep. So you see, one of the things I think that's interesting is that Fitts' law militates, is sort of conflicts with an aesthetic that a lot of application designers have. They want to make things very, very small because they want to have an elegant application with as little clutter as possible. But the smaller everything gets, the harder it is to actually move your pointing device to it. Did anyone have any other thoughts about any other heuristics that we haven't mentioned? No. Okay. So why don't you close your laptops? So if you're interested in reading more, there's a nice essay that Don Norman and Bruce Tognacini wrote, How Apple is Giving Design a Bad Name, in which they lay out this argument that Apple has turned its back on all the wonderful things that it used to do, and now that it's much more focused on visual appearance. So I want to say a few things about Don Norman's heuristics. And he wrote this wonderful book. It was originally called The Psychology of Everyday Things, which had the lovely acronym POET. But then he found that bookstores kept putting it in the psychology department, and it was really about design. So he actually changed the name in the next edition to The Design of Everyday Things, which unfortunately made it DOET, which wasn't quite as good as POET. But the book, interestingly enough, despite a really terrible initial review in the New York Times that said it was a useless book and that Norman was crazy and that he was just ranting about how horrible everything was, the book, in fact, became a huge bestseller and had a huge influence on designers, and it's also had a big influence on software designers because many of Don Norman's ideas turn out to have very nice application in user interfaces. So I want to mention two of his ideas, affordances and mapping. So the term affordance was actually coined by a psychologist who was talking about the relationship that you have as a human being to a physical object like a chair, and that you can somehow sense that a chair affords the experience of sitting. And Don Norman sort of captured this term and repurposed it a little bit to mean that a user interface should advertise to the user what its affordances are. It should make very clear, using what he now calls signifiers. It should signal to the user, this button is for pressing, this slider is for sliding, and so on. And so although the idea originally arose with the fact that as human beings we interact with things because they have these sort of natural affordances, Don Norman was much more concerned, not with traditional things like this, but with the mistakes that we make in design. And so his argument was that if you see a door like this, you're going to pull on that handle and you're going to push on that plate. And so he would say that that affords pushing and that side affords pulling. And much of his book, well, not actually that much of his book, but perhaps the most famous part of his book is a collection of images and stories about what came to be called Norman doors. And apparently, people became so obsessed with this idea that he still gets emails from people with photographs of Norman doors. But here are a few that I found online that are kind of entertaining. It's really not clear what to do with this one. Do you push or do you pull this door? This is what Don Norman nicely called a user manual. And you can see it needs a user manual, right? Because the affordance is pull, but actually you have to push. So they stuck the user manual onto the door. This one's particularly nice. So anyway, so one of the things that you can ask yourself is, what is the user interface signaling to you to do with it? And that's the idea of affordance. The idea of mapping and consistency is that in many designs, there's an underlying domain, what I would say lies in the concepts that underlie the application, and that domain has some structure to it. And if you can actually mirror that structure in the structure of the user interface, you can sometimes make the application much easier to use. So here's Don Norman's classic example, where he was talking about the design of stovetops. And he points out that most stovetops are designed like the one on the left and not like the one on the right. And the problem is that in the one on the left, you need to have, as he would call it, user manuals, right? You need to have labels to tell you what the mapping is between the burners and the controls, because they're not mapped in a natural way. Whereas in the case of the one on the right, you can see that there's a kind of a straightforward physical relationship, that if you want the burner in the top right, then you should turn the control in the top right too. Everyone get that idea? Now, one of the things that I think is completely wonderful and hilarious that my brother pointed out to me when we read this book together many years ago is that Donald Norman actually fell for this mistake himself. And I pointed this out to him, and he was not amused by this. And he says it wasn't his fault and he never got to check it. But I think it's just so funny that I have to show it to you. If you actually look at the pages of the book that show this, there are 4 different figures representing 4 different stovetops. And those figures are represented by 3 different captions that are placed sequentially from the top on the right and bear apparently no mapping relationship to the figures demonstrating mapping. So I think that's really quite incredibly funny. So let's see. So I have one more little exercise for you before we talk about dark patterns. So what I want you to do is I want you to put all of this together. And the truth is this exercise could take hours, days, weeks. I mean, there are consultants who spend their life doing this kind of thing. And I don't want you to spend a lot of time doing this. I want to just give you a little flavor of it by having you look at a website now that you're empowered by all these ideas of heuristics and mapping and consistency and affordances and so on. And I want you to just pick one thing, okay? Because I don't want us to spend a lot of time on this. Pick one thing that you think is wrong with with one of these websites and explain it using the notions that we've learned. And this is from a wonderful list I found of the worst websites of 2017. And they're really quite spectacular, perhaps with the exception of the Alfred Sung one, which isn't quite as spectacular as the others. But the others are really wonderful. So you can take this as a moment of entertainment as well. So pick one of these, and then and find one design flaw. Okay, let's talk about these a little bit. So let's start with the Yale Art School. So it certainly fulfills the role of being provocative art that makes you think again. What do we think of this website as a website design? Megan likes it. Tell us what you like about it, Megan.
I think it's not generic, so it's memorable. It doesn't look like every other website online.
I like that. That's right. You could never accuse this site of being cookie cutter, right? This is definitely something new. Yeah. Certainly true. Costa?
This like
Is it what?
Is this safe for all individuals to look at?
Is it safe?
Seizures, why?
Oh, that's a very interesting point, actually. Yeah, does it have a risk of like seizures for people who have epilepsy? It might well do, actually. Yeah, I would worry about that. Actually, I should be careful displaying such things, yes. Yeah, it's very hard to know where to go. So there's a real problem in terms of showing you your navigation. What other? That's a heuristic violation. What else? Adrian.
The thing's out of date because they're in October 31.
Sorry,
It's out of date because they're in October 31.
Oh, it's out of date, yeah. Yes, Hussein. Sorry, not Ayush.
I feel like there wouldn't have been even a single person who would have gone to this website, realized, oh, I haven't actually registered, so I'm going to do it right now. Because of this website, it's just an obnoxious message. It doesn't accomplish. I just don't see that it would have accomplished what it set out to in any way.
Maybe it detects whether you're on the voting roll from your IP address, and if you are, it stops flashing it at you. That's a good point. Jonathan.
So the background scrolls really slowly, and it's kind of hard to figure out the movement unless you really focus on it. So
Yeah.
that might be.
Yeah, so there's a lot of weird stuff going on. Other sort of major heuristic violations. What about the simple functions you might actually want to perform with a website like this? Well, I'll give you one. There's a simple Fitts law problem, right? That the menu items are so small. It's going to take you quite a while to pick your menu item and to find it. What else? Yes?
In terms of like information sent, I guess like click here doesn't mean anything. Like in order to know what that is, you have to actually look at like the tiny text.
I think that's exactly right. Remind me of your name? Toby. So Toby, I think actually information sent is probably the biggest problem here, right? Coupled with the Gestalt principles of organization, there's no way that your brain can actually get any sense of how this page is organized. That's clearly intentional, right? But it really inhibits usability. You have no idea of what your options are, or where to go, or what the consequence of going there will be. In fact, the consequence of going to most of these places is to get another page that has this kind of style. So they're certainly consistent. Okay, let's look at another one. Which one should we look at? Should we look at Paradise with a View? So another really beautiful site. This is a particularly lovely feature. That's very useful. So what do we think of this? Yes, Darius. Right. You certainly don't know, well, it's immediately clear that if I want a vacation, I should click here to see my options, right? That's absolutely right. What else? Yes?
There's like different colorings, so I can't tell if they're links or not.
Right, so my guess is there's not very consistent there. It actually would also be interesting to look at this, with one of the accessibility sites that shows you how this would appear to someone who's colorblind, because that would probably produce some weird changes. Yes, Michael.
Even if you enjoy the cursor lettering, mouse over the calendar and just kind of get stuck. So that's like really inconsistent with everywhere else.
Oh, is that true? Let me see.
You can mouse over anything else and it'll follow you, but not on the calendar.
Oh, look at that. Actually, it got stopped. There's a little bug there. We should complain. This website is non-functional. The most exciting feature is broken. This is terrible. All right. Do we want to look at another one, or have we had enough? Move on? Look at another one versus move on. Look at another one. All right, which one do you want to look at? Alfred Sung, okay. Who could have known that bad websites could be so entertaining? Okay, so this cannot be accused of not being elegant. Oh, I'm going to ignore, I don't know if I even want to even click on that. Who knows what that's going to do? Okay, so what is wrong with this website? So certainly I don't think you can complain that there's a violation of Gestalt principles, right? Yes, Julia.
So when you actually hover over the 4 options on the left,
Yeah.
there's no distinguish, like it doesn't really react as to like which one you're selecting. So there's just
There's no feedback, so it violates the feedback principle. That's right, yeah. Hussein.
The mobile website's different, but also if you hover over the transitioning images, I don't think you can click on them, or at least on the mobile app.
Ah, interesting. But you can actually click on them in the desktop app. Interesting. And now I can't get back again. That's not good. Let's reload. Whoa. So I think this might be a Flash website, which is why it's also sort of so slow and has that initial little video thing. What else? Yes, Adrian.
Just Fitzlog, like you have this entire white screen, all your functional things are in a tiny space in the back.
Yep, you've got this huge amount of screen space, but you've got to hit these tiny things. Yes. Exactly. So you've got these really long paths, and you don't have any sense of where you are in the navigation. Notice oh, there it is. I guess you have some sense there, but it's not as nice as using the conventional breadcrumbs. And you have to look at one item at a time, right? Whereas you really want to see 20 items and what your options are, and you don't see that. It's Addy, right? Thank you, Addy. Yes? Yeah. Oh, interesting. There are funny ways in which that thing behaves. So that's actually a lesson to do with, convention, which is don't invent a new kind of navigation widget unless you're really prepared to put a lot of work into it, because it's actually a very difficult thing to do well. Okay, any other thoughts? I know. Do you want to see the other one? Do you want to talk about the other one as well? Who wants to see the other one as well? Oh my goodness, okay. Fewer, but there's enthusiasm. We'll do this quickly. What was the last one? UAT? Oh yeah, this was the one that video game torture. This is for a technical school, so I assume they teach a web design as part of this. And this has this nice feature that, how do you get these things to go up? You sort of go like this, right? And oh, there they go. Oh, they're working for me. What do we think of that? And I think, can you capture these? Oh, and they do actually stop. Oh, sometimes they stop, if you get them in exactly the right place. So what do we think of this? What heuristics does this violate? Yes?
I think there's it violates information time for lack thereof, just because there's so much going on, you don't really know where to go. Also, if you hover over the menus, it's just sort of are at the top.
At the top, these.
Yeah, or the one next to that. There are just so many options.
Wow. Yeah, so many options, right. So there's a real information scent problem and a real Fitzlaw problem here too. Oh my goodness, look at this. We've got multiple levels of menus. This is quite complicated. Yeah. All right, so we could have a lot of fun with all the heuristic problems here. Let's get back to more miserable things. So I want to talk about dark patterns, because it is Halloween. Okay. Dark patterns. So this is something, here's an idea. So if you wouldn't mind closing your laptops, this is an idea that you're all familiar with, but you might not know this term for it. And it's important to think about this, not only because you want to be a good designer, but you also want to be an ethical designer. So dark patterns are not so much about making things usable, but about intentional ways that some designers actually design their sites to get the users to do things very effectively that they don't want to do. So here's just one example I saw recently, doing a Java upgrade. And the Java upgrade very helpfully offers to give me a Yahoo homepage and a new tab on Safari and Chrome. if I click next and don't undo that option. So I don't know how much Yahoo paid Oracle to do that, but that does not make most users happy. Here's one I saw on Amazon last week. So I was actually buying a birthday present for a friend in England using Amazon Co. UK, and I don't have Prime there. And so it's trying to sell me Prime, but notice what's going on here. So I've got to the point where I'm about to check out, and if you look at this widget down here at the bottom, can you see that the yellow thing says try Prime free? And without looking at it, what would you guess the blue thing underneath does? It says continue. And you think it's going to say continue without getting Prime free. But in fact, it doesn't say that. The top, that's in fact one button. And the yellow bit will switch you to, will enroll you in Prime, and the bottom one will enroll you in Prime. And in fact, if you don't want to enroll in Prime, you have to hit that much more obscure link on the left in the blue text that says continue and don't gain Amazon Prime benefits. So these are what are called, have been named dark patterns by this British usability designer, Harry Brignall. And there's a nice catalog of them that you can look at online. And here are a few more of them. These are a few famous ones. This was one that got actually Microsoft into a lot of trouble. It turned out, you see that little red X in the top corner? It turned out that if you click there, that actually installed it, installed the upgrade. And as you can imagine, that did not make them popular. That's called a bait and switch, which is that the user sets out to do one thing, and you actually systematically undermine it. And so, as you can imagine, the press was pretty critical of Microsoft for that. Here's another one, that you get a subscription for something, and then they very helpfully tell you, if you want to undo your subscription, then of course you can't do it online. Just feel free to call customer services. And notice there's no phone number for customer services. You're going to have to find that. And you're probably going to need to get a phone book, because that's probably not online either. So this is a strategy that Harry Brignall calls forced continuity, where you sign up for a product, and it includes automatic renewals that are very hard to stop. Another example of this is how Audible, at least at one time, used to sell its products, that when you bought something, it listed as a purchase something that was actually a monthly fee. So you thought you were just paying $8 or whatever, but actually you'd signed up for $8 a month until you canceled it. Here's another example from Skype. They say, if you don't like things and you want your money back, then we'll try and help you. And if we're unable to help you and you still want to close your account, then we'll take you through to our customer service team. So of course, this is written to sound, oh, so helpful, it's so wonderful. But what it really says is that if you actually try and cancel the product, we're going to take you through 1,000,000 steps and probably keep you waiting on the phone for a very long time. This dark pattern, Brignall gives a delightful name, Roach Motel. Easy to get into a situation, but hard to get out. So you guys are probably too young for this, but there used to be a device called the Roach Motel, which was like a little thing with poison in it that captured, if you had roaches in your kitchen, you could put it down, and it would, once they got in, they were stuck and would die in some horrible way. And the tagline for Roach Motel was, they check in, but they never check out. So that's the idea here. You check in, you buy the product, and you never check out again. Here's another typical dark pattern, which is, this is not family viewing. But a very common thing that there are all kinds of little, things that you didn't expect, hidden costs. I should be careful and look through these slides before I show them in something that's being videoed for posterity. Here's one. This is one of my favorites. So this is actually from the British cable TV company Sky, and so very helpfully they allow you to opt in or out of their spamming list. And so there you see you have a button that says, Sky may contact you about products. So the question is, do you click that or not? No. Megan says, no, you don't click that. Well, look at what it says underneath that. May contact you about products and services you may like, unless you click to opt out. So it turns out that is actually the opt-out button. It's wonderful, eh? So trick questions. So the user is required to respond to a question that doesn't really mean what they think it means. And there's just no limit to the kinds of clever things that people can do. Here's a delightful one. It turned out that this company, Curry's PC World, they had a website that was actually designed to prevent you from comparison shopping. And so if you attempted to cut and paste some text from that site, like you took the name of the camera, for example, and you just did a select and then copy, it actually was designed to prevent you from doing that. They'd hacked the JavaScript so that you couldn't do the copy. And then they realized, so that was in 2014, and then they realized that was really very unfriendly. And so in 2016, they added a new feature, which was that if you tried to do the cut and paste, they simply plopped up a message. They allowed you to do the copy, but they plopped up a message telling you they would beat any competitor's price. Pretty aggressive. So that's price comparison prevention, where the functionality is crippled to make it hard to compare prices. So that's the idea of dark patterns. I guess I'm behind on checking off where we've got to in the excitement of it all. So that's dark patterns. And I think the particular examples of dark patterns are useful, and he's done a great service by calling out all these websites that do this kind of thing. But unlike heuristics, I don't think these are things that you need to study or learn. The important thing is to be aware of this idea and to recognize when you might be working in a context in which you might be encouraged to actually implement a dark pattern, or you might actually have some inclination to do it yourself because of your wonderful startup, and you're thinking, if only we could retain users better, let's do this and that. You always have to remember, well, let's do it in a way that isn't going to actually make our users miserable. Before I talk about prototyping, which is the last item on our menu for today, I wanted to just point out that all these kinds of delightful things that we've talked about are not new to graphical user interfaces. They all existed before that. And so I wanted to show you some fun things with our old friend Unix. So how many of you actually have used the Unix shell? OK, so pretty much, well, half of you, something like that. So one of the things you might not have realized is that the reason that people have some trouble learning Unix is that the shell behaves in an extremely strange way. And it's one of these things where when you become familiar with it, you might not have realized how strange the things are that you become familiar with. So I want to show you some examples of using a Unix command, which is the most basic Unix command. And you might be thinking, as I show you these examples, well, that's sort of obvious. There's no real problem here. But I want you to think about this and ask yourself, if you were coming at this afresh, without any preconceptions, without any understanding of Unix, could you really make sense of this? So let's suppose we're in a Unix shell, and we ask to see the contents of a directory. Very helpfully, the command is called ls in Unix. So we execute ls to list the contents of the directory. And it tells us that there are 3 things in the directory named A, B, and D. And now what I do is I move D to C. OK? And now I do an ls. And I get A, B, and C. OK? So what has move actually done? Yes, Costa. Rename, exactly. So move is really a rename operation, OK? So suppose now I do move A to B. What's that going to do? Yes, that Jonathan?
It just actually moves it to B, into B.
Moves it into B. What does it move to move? What does it mean to move it into B?
It makes A a subdirectory of B.
If B is a directory, what if B is a file?
And overwrite.
It's going to override it, right. So in fact, that is the case here. So if you now see what's there, you'll find you only have B and C. And so in this case, move is clobber, right? Would you be happy with this if you weren't expecting this? Probably not. Which of the considerations that we've talked about would you say this violates? What criterion of usability? Do you remember we talked about different criteria of usability? Darius? Oh, absolutely. Certainly consistency. That's right. I was thinking of error tolerance for this particular one, right? Which is this is not very tolerant of the user making an error. How about this one? I move B to C, expecting the same thing to happen, and then I get C, but if I look inside C, I see B. So that was Jonathan's example. So in that case, it just happens that C was a directory. And if you move B to C, then what does that mean? It means move. Right? So what's actually going on is that this one command has all these different interpretations depending on context. It's a kind of violation of the uniformity that we talked about in conceptual design. And the point is that, if you're very used to Unix, you might be able to work around these things. But for novices, this is really a bit of a nightmare. And actually, even for expert users, it can be a problem because they can sometimes make mistakes. So let me show you a couple of famous mistakes. Let's suppose I look in a directory, and that directory contains a whole load of source files, say a whole load of C files, right? Has all my work in it. So I've been writing this program for a long time. I have a collection of source files, and I also have the object files there as well, produced by the compiler. And now what I want to do is I want to delete all of the object files because I want to recompile, say. So what command would I use to delete all of the object files in Unix? Someone want to tell us? Yes, Michael. Exactly. You would type rm star.o. Now I want you to tell me, well, I can tell you, because you don't have your laptop open in front of you, what is the character on the same key as the dot if you're holding down the shift key? And the answer is, it's greater than. And so what happens if you're still holding the shift key that you were holding to get the asterisk when you type the dot? Well, what you type instead is rm star arrow O. Do you know what that does? Yes, Michael.
Delete everything because everything is bigger in value than 0.
It deletes everything, and it puts the results of the command into a file called O, very helpfully. So, so this is not very helpful. Here's another sad thing that can happen to you. What happens if I go move A to star? Yeah, you really don't want to do this. One of the things that's fun about these things is that you have to, I always get a little nervous when I try these things out to make sure they have the design, the effect I'm expecting as I'm preparing a lecture, and I'm doing this very late at night. I make sure that I create a directory and put it somewhere and just pray that I don't do something so bad that it's going to actually destroy everything else in my file system, that it will only destroy that directory. But the problem here is that this will just succeed in the naive way, and it will rename the file A and give it the name star. And then, of course, what is the poor novice user going to do to get rid of that file? They're going to type rm star. And then they will be very unhappy indeed. So that's not a nice situation. OK, so I recommend to you this wonderful little old book called the Unix Hater's Handbook. It was written a long time ago, but the PDF is still available online. And I think especially the chapter on the Unix shell, which is really all about usability, is really worth a read. OK, so I want to close just by saying a few things about prototyping and user testing. This could be the topic of a whole lecture. And I'm really just going to say a few things in passing. You're going to have a chance to actually do some of this in the recitation on Thursday. I guess that's tomorrow. And then in your upcoming assignment. So the reason you prototype is, in short, you can find design flaws before you actually go to the work of building the whole thing. And the other thing is, despite my great enthusiasm for conceptual design and design heuristics, which I'm very passionate about, the truth is, you can always fool yourself. You can always get it wrong because you are not your user. And you can fail to anticipate what the user will do, and you can just make egregious mistakes. And you often don't really understand that till you try it. And so there are a whole different collection of ways you can prototype. There's a spectrum of fidelity from paper prototypes like this, to full functional prototypes, which are basically little almost implemented systems. There's an idea that you should know about called the Wizard of Oz prototype. And the idea is that you give the participant in your test the impression that they're dealing with a fully implemented system. But actually what they're interacting with is a shell, and you're sort of behind the wall, and when they type something, you type something that allows you to basically simulate the computer reacting in a way without actually having to implement it. And that can be done with paper prototyping too, where you ask the user to do something on your paper prototype, and then you say, well, and now what happens is it looks like this. The way that you're actually going to do prototyping in your assignment is one of the ways that prototyping is most commonly done, which is to use a wireframing tool. And the typical features of these tools are that they make it very easy to sketch the layout of a user interface by giving you a nice palette, typically many libraries of palettes of all the conventional kinds of widgets. And they allow you to then place things on the, so here's an example of all the palettes, well, some of the palettes. There are millions of them that you can get. This is in particular for Adobe XD, which is Adobe's product. And then you can basically build a collection of different wireframes from these palettes that represent different states of the system. And then what most of these wireframing tools provide you with is a nice way to link these together to actually establish a flow between them, so that you can actually say, well, if you click on this link or press this button, you'll go from here to here. And bear in mind, this is not like an implementation, because what you'll typically do is you'll have like a search field with some text in it, right? And you'll simply, you'll write some sample text in, and then you'll hard code the results of doing that text, of doing that search, so that the link will actually take you to another screen that has the search results hardwired in it. So these are just mock-ups. They're not actually giving you any real behavior. And so the way you actually use these things is you build this prototype, and then you sit someone down in front of it, and you basically watch how they actually try and do a particular task. And to make this useful, you have to formulate that task carefully. So typically what you'll do is you'll come up with a short list of tasks, and you'll present the task to them either by suggesting some actions they might take, or perhaps suggesting an eventual goal you would like them to reach. I would like you to be able to delete this file. I'd like you to be able to, to create a tweet. I'd like you to be able to friend this person or whatever. And then you watch carefully as they do it. And then you cringe as you realize all the problems with your design, because they start doing things that you never anticipated. Okay, so that's the idea of user testing. So I think we are 3 minutes short of the end of lecture, and I'm sure everyone would like a 3-minute break. So we'll call it a day and enjoy the rest of the week.